the questions, and we will appreciate if you can just tell us a little bit about your background and which kind of work you are doing at the moment.
Okay. I sometimes tell people I was lucky enough to come from a family, a background that was progressive and anti-racist, and was interested in social justice and psychology and some kind of spirituality in a sense. So for me, those three areas are still very motivating for me. I'm a counselor educator. I've done professional counseling. Right now, I teach master's level school counselors at Brooklyn College, and I'm also in the urban education doctoral program at CUNY Graduate Center. I sometimes also call myself a Buddhist. I'm not technically a Buddhist, although I've been inspired by a lot of Buddhism. I tend to be a critical thinker who kind of broods, who kind of contemplates the contemplative. So that's one way I see myself. So I am teaching my students. I'll tell you a bit about that a little later. Some mindfulness and some critical or social ways of looking at mindfulness from what's an integral perspective. I can talk a little bit about that too. What I've done a while ago, I wrote a book. I worked with high school young men who were on an American football team, and I used that. They were interested in playing in the zone, so I used that as a hook to get them to meditate. But it was really what it really was a counseling group, and so we would use mindfulness in ways, not just in an individual sense, but to get them to look at their whole life and to step back and look at things from a broader perspective. So I wrote that up as a book called Boys to Buddhas, and that was one of my earlier projects. I've written other articles on a kind of a critical perspective on mindfulness. One was called Occupy Mindfulness. My colleague Ron Purser and I recently co-edited a book called The Handbook of Mindfulness, Culture, Context, and Social Engagement. And I have a chapter in there, and we have a preface there that's also available online. What else was I going to tell you? Oh, well, he and I have a podcast called The Mindful Cranks, because okay. We've taken on some people. Again, I can share my approach, but we took this name in a humorous sense. But we've been interviewing a number of people in terms of a podcast, people who kind of share our perspective on mindfulness. And I'm currently writing a book on mindfulness in education. So that's kind of where I am right now.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have like different topics in which we can explore more.
Sure.
And I may like to ask you first if you can share with us, how do you teach or engage with your students in terms of the contemplative practices and mindfulness?
Okay, well, I kind of break it down in terms of a normative or conventional approach in terms of counseling, and then I have a more critical or integral approach. So they're really inseparable, but I'm kind of breaking them down. I mean, in terms of my counseling students, well, we try to somewhat create a contemplative or mindful classroom. So I invite people to meditate, and sometimes it helps. We're a little bit more calm and focused, and are able to, that sometimes helps a discussion. I'm fortunate really to be a counselor educator, because in counseling, students really need to be mindful. So there's three areas that they're interested in using it. One is just personally, in terms of their own personal development, in terms of being being more self-aware about their condition, habits, and thoughts and feelings. I also get them to look at their level of development, but I can talk about that in a little bit. Yes, sure.
Thank you.
So the first one was to help them personally, their own personal issues. The second one is to help them professionally,
Mm-hmm.
so that they can be it enhances their counseling skills. So because counselors need to be empathic and to be non-judgmental, listen, and to be aware of their own prejudices and biases and conditioned thoughts and feelings while they are counseling in a professional way. And also, as they work with their colleagues, they need to also be very present and not be reactive, not let their some of their conditioned thoughts and feelings get in the way of their professional work. So it's personal, and then development, professional work as counselors. And the third way would be to help if they are developing a practice themselves, to help students, particular students who are interested in or who could benefit from a kind of a practice where the students themselves could be less reactive and more self-aware, and as well as working with colleagues, with teachers or administrators, and also in terms of helping the whole school. So those are kind of the more traditional, conventional ways that I offer mindfulness for the counseling students. The broader, more critical approach that I take is from an integral point of view,
Mm-hmm.
and people generally associate that with the works of Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber developed a kind of meta model, kind of an integral model that insists on looking at not just the subjective first person point of view, but also second and third points of view. In other words, looking at development, stages of development, not just states of consciousness or awareness, looking at culture from at least two different perspectives, and looking at certainly looking at objective individual point of view, which is also very popular in contemplative practice and counseling. But then the other, the social structure, looking critically at the social structure and the policies, in particular, for example, in education. So my point of view is I would never just do individual mindfulness as a strictly kind of counseling or therapeutic approach. I insist on our students looking at kind of embedding or contextualizing the practice in terms of those areas, in terms of, in particular, developmental, cultural, and social, political and social structure. So we're always looking at that. We're always looking at how we sometimes critique articles that don't do that. They only look at how, in a way, how students can be adjusted to the school system with kind of traditional mindfulness approaches. So I include a kind of more critical social mindfulness based on a kind of an integral model with the students.
Okay, thank you very much. And regarding this more integral perspective, would you say that it's like you can see any specific pattern in terms of the mindfulness global movement in different, like within the US, for example, Europe and Asia? Would you say something about this pattern?
Something about the pattern of
Yeah, maybe if you consider that it's a pattern within these three different areas or cultural things, or would you say it's more like in specific countries? How can you expand on that?
So are you asking, is the kind of traditional approach to mindfulness more common, or is the integral one?
The more integral perspective.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I know, I'm happy to have colleagues in the UK, in Britain, that are taking a much broader perspective on mindfulness. I just got an invitation from Mind and Life Institute and Brown University here, where they finally, in my opinion, finally saying, yes, we must of course take into account the cultural and social and political context of mindfulness. Now that surprised me because I'd been to a conference of theirs 2 years ago and I hardly saw any of that. So I think that these trends are happening. I certainly see it. I see it a little bit here. I see some of it in the UK. My colleague Ron Person and he has some colleagues. We have colleagues in Finland uh, and in Italy. So we're seeing some of that happening. Um, um, I know there's a European integral conference that happens every year. I've never been able to go, but that's kind of always been around a little bit. Whether that's getting applied to meditation or mindfulness, I'm not so sure. I don't know. I don't know if that helps answer.
Yes. Yeah, totally. I think I may ask you if you can say like that right now you can see that there are more opportunities and people and the academic field it's more attentive to this more cultural and socio-political context of the practice of mindfulness. Would you say that there are specific challenges within this?
Within the academic field?
Yeah, in any way, like, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot, sure. There's, first of all, well, again, the dilemma, the typical approach has been, what I've seen is just first and third person perspectives. In other words, like certain contemplative studies programs that I saw would focus on contemplative experience. And then they would be interested in looking at the neurological correlates. They would be looking at neuroscience or kind of, again, the third person objective point of view. And they like as I said, they're kind of late to the party. They're kind of, it seems to me they're finally picking up on other critiques and concerns from other academics that say, hey, we need to look at the cultural context. We need to look at intersubjectivity. In fact, I have an article, a chapter coming out in a book where the focus is on the intersubjective perspective on contemplative education. So in other words, it is happening. I mean, and there are more academics in this field that are taking that into account. They're looking at group dynamics and interpersonal relationships and more broadly. I mean, what I'm happily impressed with the work of Stephen Stanley is that he's doing that from an even broader cultural perspective, which I've always been interested in. And again, from an integral point of view, there's that kind of fits into the integral meta model, where you start looking at kind of unspoken, unaddressed cultural norms and cultural values that are in the background that people are not aware of. So, for example, in a school, the school climate, the school culture might be very competitive, or it might maybe very alienating, or people don't feel very close. And so it's important to try, if you can be mindful, and you can have a mindful state, but if you're not aware of the kind of, the cultural background, the cultural, the culture of the school, in terms of how interpersonally people are relating, or what the implicit values and expectations are of the school, you're just spinning your wheels in a way. You can breathe and you can notice things, but you're not getting at that background. So I mean that's starting, certainly with the work of Stephen Stanley and his colleagues, is starting to do that, and I think that's very important. There's a lot of other issues. I mean, that there's certainly more. They show up more in terms of public education. So, for example, the whole issue of religion. People say, well, is it a kind of a, are some people sneaking in a Buddhist, Buddhism into the meditation? People will use a Tibetan bowl You know, is there, you know, so is there kind of an implicit religious issue? That's one discussion. The other very important one that colleagues that are doing research in neuroscience are looking at some of the negative effects of mindfulness, which is trauma. For some people, it may trigger some trauma. It may trigger some difficult memories. It may trigger a kind of sense of disorientation and loss, and so of loss of orientation. So those are, I mean, those are issues that are always important to address. I still think that we have a long way to go. I mean, I think that to be able to challenge a kind of dualistic thinking about mindfulness, it's still very individualistic. It's still seen as very privatized. It's something that's intrapsychic. It's still in somebody, you know, in some people's head. It's disembodied in a way. It's kind of a Cartesian acceptance of the Cartesian dualism. So, for example, people will still talk about emotions or feelings in this very abstract way, as if they're just floating, or as if they're just cut off from actual everyday existence, from everyday social existence.
Yeah.
And I, you know, again, I think that Stephen Stanley's work and Bill Murray in Finland are people are doing much more work around seeing it as embodied work.
Okay, and I think this last point is very important, and I would like to link the embodiment of the practice in relation to the professionalization of mindfulness. Is that clear?
It may become clear the more you describe that. Let's see.
Yes, yeah, don't worry. I mean that, what do you think in regarding the people who is like being upskilled in relation to mindfulness courses and in relation to teaching mindfulness, but at the same time, maybe these people is not quite aware of this context and the social and political characteristics of the mindfulness practice.
Right. That's definitely a concern that I have and my colleague Ron Persa have, and that's one reason we wrote the book and edited the book. It's one reason we have our podcast. We think we're concerned about a loss of, and you know, a lot of people have said this, a kind of a loss of an ethical foundation, a loss of a sense of social context. It's still very predominantly an individualistic, as I said earlier. It's much about personal adjustment to the world. It's mostly about stress reduction. It's missing a lot of those contexts. So that when there are certainly people making a fair amount of money, being teachers and spreading a kind of more this kind of approach, which people do what they're going to do, but we're going to continue raising questions about that, and we have a concern, a critique about society, which we think that we're not the only ones. We talk about neoliberalism, we talk about a market valued society, both in the UK and in the United States, where everything is about individualism and personal responsibility and individual adjustment. And so we see that many people are promoting that kind of point of view without trying to figure out a way to include a more critical and more contextual approach to mindfulness. I think that, again, other people have said this, since mindfulness has been kind of cut off from its Buddhist roots, where at least it had a sense of ethics and had a kind of a wisdom and a worldview. It's become a technology. It's become a technology, so it gets to be used. It's been used here in the military. It's been used definitely for corporations, for adjusting workers and so on. And people are making money from that. So we're trying to look at it much more, again, as many of your colleagues, from a more critical, contextual, and social context. you know, we take a stand in terms of trying to you know, not just have people adjust to this unjust system, but to create a better society, and to recognize our own interdependence beyond that kind of a cliche, and to really figure out a way to make those connections.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we would be like keep talking about the topic, but I'm wondering if we can move to the next question, which is related to any kind of practice or resources that you would like to share with the audience.
Sure. Let me see what I have. Well, one thing I do, I'll show up these pictures in a second, but one thing I try to do with my students is, you know, the usual approach with mindfulness is, well, you focus on your breathing and you notice what comes up, and so you notice what thoughts come up, you know, maybe. And so what I try to do is I suggest that they sort of guide. Oh, and then you can witness or label some of those thoughts or feelings. And one way I try to kind of have a more integral or contextualized approach is suggesting that they can make a series of labels or categories that show how some of our own conditioned thoughts and feelings are conditioned by the larger society. So, for example, if somebody notices that they're very perfectionistic, they might connect that to not only some of the messages that they're given by their family, but also maybe maybe they grew up in a kind of a upper middle class or a posh neighborhood where there was a lot of pressure to be perfect, you know. So they start connecting their thoughts and feelings to larger categories. You know, young girls and women have issues. Some of them have issues around self-compassion and self-esteem and so on. Those are often conditioned by the media, by what the media and the corporate media and the larger society the messages that young girls and women will get. So what I'm trying to do is link not just kind of neutral categories that we often hear from meditation teachers. You know, there's thinking, or there's planning, or there's you're thinking about the future, but to make them a little more concrete in terms of actual categories that we might talk about as coming from the larger culture, coming from the larger social structure. So that's one exercise that I try to do with my students. The other one is I really insist on that they look at stages of development, and they look at their own stages of development. So I will use models from Robert Keegan, who's a Harvard developmentalist. I'll look at Suzanne Cook-Greuter, who's continued the work of Jane Lovinger in terms of ego development. Again, what I'm interested in is it's not, as Ken Wilber would point out, it's not just states of consciousness. We have to look at stages, because in our own particular stages of self-development, because they filter to much extent our own experiences. Or how do we process our experience of being in a state, a mindful state or contemplative state, has a lot to do with our particular stage of personal development. The classic example, is about the monks in Japan during World War II, who might have reached very high states of contemplation, but in terms of their stage of development, they were very conventional at best, and not a healthy stage of convention. In other words, they were authoritarian. They would do whatever the emperor told them to do. So again, you have to look at both states and stages. And so I always try to get my students to consider, you know, where are they at in terms of some of these models of self-development, and then to also get them to think about the students that they're working with. What stage are those students? Most students are at egocentric stage. It's all about me, or they're at a conventional stage where I want to please people, or I want to go along with the crowd. Again, you can meditate, but what I'm interested in is, can you also use mindfulness in a conscientious way for development, to become aware of what stage of development you're at, and then to be more mindful of that, and to maybe sort of climb the ladder, maybe sort of evolve developmentally. Also, cultures of schools are at different levels of development.
Right.
Again, some schools are very egocentric. Everybody's out for themselves. Some schools, culturally, developmentally, are, I'm just going to go along. There's not much critical thinking. There's not much encouragement of autonomy or autonomous thinking. So even a culture of a school can be looked at in terms of orders or levels of development. So that's a big exercise that I try to include. I can show you a couple of pictures if I can get them up there. I'll show you also what I try to do.
Yeah, I think we have a couple of minutes before we end the interview, so I'm happy to see the pictures.
Okay. Let me see what I can do. I always show this. I show this whenever I give a talk. I know Stephen has been to many of my talks, and he's heard my shtick already. Let me see. Is this?
Yeah.
Can you see that picture?
Yeah, I can't see the title, but
That's okay. Yeah. Just
okay.
The picture.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I show this when I give a talk. I show this to my students, and it's a very extreme, two poles.
Yeah.
Of on one side you have the corporate executives, and they're being mindful because they want to be calm. They don't want to be stressed out. They want to be more productive. And on the other side, that's one context, and the other context is two people getting arrested at Occupy Wall Street in 2012 in downtown New York, in downtown Manhattan, and they're using the meditation of mindfulness in a very different kind, for a different purpose. They're using it to raise consciousness around social injustice and so on. And so I just want to kind of try to wake up the class or an audience for talk to thinking about that. It's not just this vague thing of the mindfulness. You always have to look at the context. And then
right.
I have even more shocking pictures we got from a colleague who's from Sweden.
Okay.
But he's very clever. I wish I had thought of this. He takes a quote. In this case, let's see. This is a quote from a well-known psychologist, a very popular psychologist, Tara Brach, who talks about radical acceptance of it's very therapeutic and individualistic. And he takes the quote, and I'll read the quote, but I'll show you the picture first. And he juxtaposes it. He puts together the quote and the picture to try to shock people a little bit into thinking about the tendency in mindfulness to think very abstractly and without the context, without the social context. So here's a picture. Let me see if I can describe it. Let's see.
Okay.
See the picture?
Yes. Yeah.
So you see there's a homeless man and a bunch of well-dressed young women who are posing for a picture, right? So it's a very obviously, you might see this in London or in Cardiff or in New York sometimes, and the quote is, radical acceptance is the willingness to experience ourselves and our lives as it is, You see, so okay, when you think about that quote, it's okay, it sounds good, but when you try to contextualize what does everyday life really mean, what is going on politically and socially and culturally in our society. I mean, we have so many things we need to fight for and oppose and resist. So that's kind of a way to hopefully get people to think about it. I have two more if you're interested. I don't have to show them. Actually, I have one more. This, and then I have one more exercise if we still have time. This is a unfortunate, sort of sad picture. It's a
Can you put it just like more towards you so we can see the whole picture?
Yes.
That's perfect. Yeah.
Oh, good. So this is a Syrian woman, I think, who was trying to escape from Turkey to Greece. So she's in the water, and it's a quote from John Kabat-Zinn. He says, "Well, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." So again, it says, it sounds great, but what's the context? So let's bring ourselves not just in the absolute world of the absolute um, beautiful world, which it is, but also we have to look at everyday
Yeah.
life, look at the world that we're living in, and how do we put the two together? So that, and I have one more. This is an exercise I did with my students.
Okay.
Um,
I think we have time for that last one.
okay, and yeah, so this is a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't know if you can read it.
Yeah, that's perfect. Peace
Peace begins, what does it say?
with you.
With your lovely smile, with your lovely smile. So, and that's great, and so there's a little, he's very good at these short little, um, almost like Dharma talks, very short little quotes. So what we do in classes, and I'm writing about this in my book, I say, well, he encourages people to smile. So I said, well, let's break that down. We live in Brooklyn. What's it like to really smile? He says, wake up every day and smile. It sounds great. What does it mean in concrete everyday real life? Let's say in Brooklyn, to smile. Okay, so women right away say, hey, if I smile, guys are going to think I'm available. Guys are going to think, they might come on to me. And if, of course, the women are in a bind. So if women don't smile, a guy might stop them on the street and say, oh, you're so pretty, why don't you smile? And so on. But we talk about the actual context of smiling. I mean, if you smile on the again, on the underground in London or the subway in New York, people are going to look at you funny. I mean, it's, why are you smiling? What does it mean to smile? And you don't just smile. You have to look. So what I'm encouraging them to do is looking at cultural context, at gender issues, at
Yeah.
power relationships, right? And developmental. I mean, if somebody smiles because they want something, they're in an egocentric stage of development. If somebody smiles because they want acceptance, that's a conventional stage. So why are you smiling? You have to look at intention, and you have to look at context. So we talk about that. I mean, that's just classroom exercise.